Welcome to the All Facts Matter podcast, where we push back against corporate media propaganda with facts, evidence, and data. I'm Peter, the author of All Facts Matter. Let's begin.
Putin's war in Ukraine is proving quite costly to Russia, but it would be both foolish and unrealistic to pretend that the costs are all one-sided. On the other side of this meat grinder of a conflict, the outlook is equally grim, and not just for Ukraine. In economic terms, Europe as a whole is sure to pay nearly as big a price as Russia. Indeed, it is easy to forget that Europe, which is to say the European Union, has been engaged in an economic contest with Russia that is every bit as stalemated and every bit as attritional as the military contest in Ukraine. Economic war may not produce the casualties that make military contests both appalling and barbaric, but it can be quite destructive in its own right. Europe is on course to learn just how destructive economic warfare can be, and sooner rather than later. Europe may not be shedding any blood yet over the war in Ukraine, but the question already deserves to be asked. How much treasure is Europe willing to pay over Ukraine? Now, there is little doubt but that the war in Ukraine has not been at all kind to Europe's economy. No sooner had Europe emerged from the severe downturn brought on by the lunacies of the COVID pandemic panic than it was confronted by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. After the invasion, economic growth within the European Union quickly declined to a fraction of what it had been post-COVID. This was an absolutely foreseeable consequence of the sanctions the European Union imposed on Russia in response to Putin's invasion. Perhaps less foreseeable, but no less inevitable. The economic deceleration by the end of 2022 had also reduced economic growth across the European Union to less than what it had been pre-COVID as well. When Europe moved to sanction Russia over Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it was imposing trade sanctions on a major trading partner. At the time, the European Union was Russia's largest trading partner, with a trade relationship that looked to be growing for the foreseeable future. And that trade relationship was not small for Europe either. Russia was Europe's fifth largest trading partner in 2021. Between the war and the sanctions regime, the EU-Russia trade has shrunk to a fraction of what it once was, both in terms of imports from Russia and exports to Russia. Now, the impact on individual nations within the European Union of the sanctions regime has been predictable. A considerable amount of economic growth has been tossed away. That the war in Ukraine was going to prove costly to Europe was a foregone conclusion even in 2022. But events since then have only underscored just how high that cost is going to be. Nor has the economic downturn in Europe been confined to just a few countries or even a few economic activities. Capacity utilization has declined across the board in Europe since the war began. The slowdown was almost immediate and could hardly have come at a worse time. The European Union had just regained its pre-COVID levels of economic activity when sanctions and the war started slowing everything down all over again. And no nation has been spared. Not Germany, not France, not Italy, not Poland. Every nation has seen its capacity, its economic capacity utilization decline as a result of both the sanctions and the war. But the decline in capacity utilization is merely the prelude. Far more significant harm to the European economy is that Europe itself is deindustrializing. Europe is losing its industrial capacity. Europe is losing its factories. Now, Germany has been by far the biggest casualty in this regard. But other industrial nations in Europe have not fared at all well as a result of the war or the sanctions themselves. Now, Germany's industrial output had already been under duress pre-COVID, and the COVID lockdowns only aggravated that situation. The war in Ukraine has not helped Germany recover its industrial base. It's cost it even more. But even Poland, which had been a rising industrial producer in Europe, has seen its output suffer as a result of the war and the sanctions. Now, this outcome was foreseeable early on, as Europe's decision to abruptly do without Russia's energy exports was a body blow to European industry as a whole. And so, what was speculation in 2022 can be fairly answered in the affirmative now at the end of 2024. Europe is deindustrializing. Now, the loss of industrial output has produced a surge of unemployment in several EU countries, Germany most especially. But Germany is far from alone in this. Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, they've all suffered in terms of job loss. And the costs are not all on the supply side of the economic equation. Europe's consumers have also paid a high price for the war in Ukraine in the form of an inflation shock. Now, inflation was already ticking up in 2021, an inevitable consequence of the COVID pandemic panic lunacies. But the war in Ukraine and the sanctions imposed on Russia only added fuel to that inflationary fire. And as has been the case on the supply side, no European nation has been spared. They've all seen their price levels rise as a result of the war and as a result of the sanctions. These are the consequences of suddenly sanctioning a major trading partner. The loss of Russian exports to Europe has made everything in Europe that much more expensive for everybody. And this combination of inflation and deindustrialization has also been hard on the euro currency. It had already taken a beating and had just begun recovering from the pandemic when the war began. And since the start of 2022, the euro has now declined against the dollar some 8.5%. Perversely, but for the war and the sanctions, the euro would have actually done better against the dollar. Since 2019, the decline of the euro against the dollar has only been about 6.8, 6.9%. But for the war and the sanctions, the euro would actually be stronger today than it had been pre-COVID. But sanctions have changed all that. Job loss, manufacturing loss, inflation, currency depreciation. Europe's economic future has dimmed considerably in direct and foreseeable consequence to the EU decision to sanction Russia over the war in Ukraine. While Ukraine has been waging a brutal war of attrition against Russia, Europe has been waging its own economic war of attrition. And economic warfare is as bloodless as conventional warfare is bloody, but the consequences to Europe are proving to be just as far-reaching. No matter how the war in Ukraine is resolved, Europe's economic landscape has been forever altered, and not for the better. Much of the lost industrial production in Europe will not soon be recovered. That production has, in many cases, moved overseas. The jobs which have been lost, particularly within industrial sectors, may be lost for good. Consumer prices, once raised, rarely decline again. When they do, that kind of deflation often proves more economically painful than inflation. And inflation and economic slowdowns are going to make the nations of Europe that much more vulnerable to price shocks should Europe find itself in as one of Donald Trump's tariff targets when he begins his second term of office next month. Now, if Donald Trump is not successful in forging a peace in Ukraine once he takes office in January, Europe will soon be compelled to confront the same question Russia already faces. How much national treasure is Europe willing to spend in an economic war with Russia? Now, there's no doubt that spending that kind of that kind of spending is a choice for Europe. Putin may have chosen to invade Ukraine, and it may be fairly have said to have started the conventional war. But Europe and the United States chose to respond with draconian sanctions. Europe, alongside the United States, chose to participate in an economic war of attrition against Russia. And every economic impact Europe is feeling right now because of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions imposed on Russia is something Europe, or at least Europe's leaders, have chosen. Has Europe chosen wisely? Can Europe justify these costs that it has incurred and will continue to incur because of the sanctions imposed on Russia? As with Russia, the justification hinges largely on which narrative one embraces regarding the conventional war in Ukraine. If one views the war in Ukraine as a result of militaristic aggression by Vladimir Putin, then perhaps the economic war is a necessary step in order to ensure that Putin does not attempt a conventional war with the rest of Europe. But if one views the war in Ukraine as a consequence of Europe and NATO recklessly expanding eastward in order to keep Russia contained, then the economic contest might seem similarly reckless. Yet, as with Russia, neither narrative has any ultimate bearing on the cost to Europe of the war or of the sanctions imposed on Russia. The costs which arise from both the war and the sanctions are going to be felt across Europe regardless of which narrative framing one applies. The deindustrialization, the job loss, the inflation, the currency depreciation, all the costs which arise from the war in Ukraine are the same regardless of why that war is being waged. The consequences come from the choice to wage, in this case, economic war, not why that choice is made. And as with Russia, Europe will be paying the cost of this war long after the guns finally fall silent and peace is obtained. And the question will always have to be asked, will it have been worth it?
And that concludes this presentation. I hope you found this podcast helpful and informative. Please like it and share this with your friends. Word of mouth is how I publicize my work. Please also consider making a one-time donation or becoming a paid subscriber to All Facts Matter. Your support is what keeps this work going, and I greatly appreciate all of my subscribers. Without you, this work would have no meaning. I encourage everyone to be especially generous with feedback. Leave a word or two in the comment section so that we can keep the discussion going and that we may learn from each other. Thank you all for listening, and have a nice day.